The morning Augusta Garrison arrived in Harlan Creek, Nevada, the sky was the color of a fresh bruise, and she had not spoken a single unnecessary word in 11 months. She stepped down from the stage with a worn leather satchel clutched against her chest, her dark hair pinned so tightly beneath her hat that it seemed to pull her expression closed, sealed off like a letter that had been written and never sent. The town was small, a single main road flanked by a general store, a livery, a doctor's office, a telegraph office, and a saloon that doubled as a hotel for those who could not afford better. Harlan Creek was the kind of place that people passed through on their way to somewhere more significant, and Augusta had chosen it for exactly that reason. No one important would think to look for her here. She had come from Virginia, though she told people she had come from Richmond when they asked and from Charlottesville when they pressed, and the truth, which was neither of those places, she kept folded somewhere deep inside her where the cold lived. The war had ended in 1865, nearly 8 years ago now, and it was 1873, and the world had supposedly been remade. Augusta did not feel remade. Augusta felt like a cup that had been dropped and glued back together, still functional in its way, still capable of holding things, but permanently, visibly cracked. She had a letter in her satchel from a man named Harold Prisick, who operated the general store in Harlan Creek, and who had written to the Women's Employment Bureau in St. Louis asking for a bookkeeper. Augusta had worked as a bookkeeper for her father before the war. She had worked as a nurse during it. She had done things during the war that bookkeeping had never prepared her for, and she had seen things that no amount of ledger columns could balance out. When she had written back to Mr. Prisick and told him she was qualified, she had been entirely truthful about her mathematics and entirely silent about everything else. The stage driver set her trunk down in the dust beside her feet and did not offer his hand to help her step down fully, which was just as well. She had managed the step herself. The air smelled of horse and iron and something faintly sweet, bread, maybe, baking somewhere nearby. Augusta stood for a moment in the middle of the road and breathed, and let the vast open sky of Nevada press down on her shoulders the way it always did, enormous and indifferent, which she found oddly comforting. The sky out here did not ask anything of her. It simply existed, huge and unpetitioned, and she could exist beneath it in the same way. She picked up her satchel and walked toward the general store. Harold Prisick was a round, cheerful man in his 50s with spectacles that sat slightly crooked on his nose and a wife named Dot who bustled out from behind the counter the moment Augusta pushed open the door, already talking before Augusta had fully entered. "You must be Miss Garrison. We expected you on the Tuesday stage, but Tuesday's stage was late, of course. It's always late when the weather comes up over the mountains. Come in, don't stand in the doorway." Harold, she's here." Augusta let herself be talked at. She had learned that letting people talk was often easier than responding, and that most people, given enough encouragement from a simple nod or a quiet yes, would fill a silence so completely that they never noticed she had not contributed anything of substance to it. "Now you'll be staying in the room above the store," Dot was saying, guiding Augusta toward a narrow staircase at the back. "It's small, but it's clean. I washed the curtains myself last week. There's a wash basin and a pitcher, and we'll bring you hot water in the mornings. Harold will show you the books tomorrow. He's been doing the accounts himself, and between you and me, he's not very good at it. Don't tell him I said so." "I won't," Augusta said, and Dot beamed at her as though she had said something exceptionally clever. The room above the store was indeed small. It had a narrow bed with a blue quilt, a writing desk beneath the window, a washstand, and a hook on the wall for coats. The window looked out over the main road, and Augusta stood at it for a long moment after Dot had gone, watching the street below. A man was unloading barrels from a wagon in front of the saloon. 2 children were chasing a dog around the corner of the livery. A woman in a yellow dress was crossing the road with a basket on her arm. Life proceeding, Augusta thought. That was what it did. It proceeded regardless. She sat on the edge of the bed and did not cry, because she had not cried in 11 months either. She set her satchel down and opened it and took out the small framed photograph she carried, a young man in a uniform, serious-faced, dark-eyed, her brother Thomas, and she set it on the writing desk and looked at it for a while, and then she put it face down so she could sleep. She started work the next morning. Harold Persick's accounts were, as Dot had suggested, a considerable disaster. There were receipts tucked into books that had nothing to do with them, figures entered in the wrong columns, and at least 3 separate incidents where Harold appeared to have simply rounded numbers to whatever seemed convenient. Augusta sat at the desk in the back of the store with the ledgers spread before her, and worked with the quiet, determined focus of a woman who knew how to make something out of chaos, because she had done it before under considerably worse conditions. She ate her meals with the Persicks at first, and they were kind people and easy company. Harold told long, meandering stories about the early days of Harlan Creek, and Dot filled the gaps with practical information about who was who in town. Augusta listened and cataloged what she needed to know and let the rest wash past her. She learned that the town had a sheriff named Burl Ames who was getting old and slow, and who everyone agreed would need replacing before long. She learned that the doctor, a man named Fitch, was competent but drank more than was ideal. She learned that there was a small school with a schoolteacher named Miss Prentice who had come from Ohio and was still adjusting to the desert heat. She learned that the saloon was owned and operated by a man named Ned Calhoun who was generally considered fair, and that attached to the saloon, which was properly called Calhoun's, though everyone just called it the saloon, there was a small dining room where travelers and those who did not keep their own kitchens could eat breakfast and supper for a reasonable price. She learned about Calvin Walden by accident, the way she learned most things in Harlan Creek, through the Persicks at dinner. "Calvin's been having trouble with his eastern fence again," Harold said one evening, helping himself to more potatoes. "That stretch along the ridge. He mended it twice last spring and the cattle keep pushing through. He needs to hire another hand," Dot said. "That ranch is too much for 2 men. He won't hear of it. You know how he is." Augusta, who did not know how he was, did not ask, but she stored the name away with the same automatic precision she stored everything: Calvin Walden Ranch, Eastern Fence, 2 men, stubborn. She met him for the first time 4 weeks after her arrival, not at the ranch but at the general store, on a Wednesday morning in early October when the air had begun to develop a proper edge of cold. She was reorganizing the back shelves. Harold had asked her to help with inventory in addition to the books, and she had agreed because being busy suited her, when the bell above the door sounded, and Harold called out a greeting of such genuine warmth that Augusta looked up despite herself. "Calvin, haven't seen you since must be 2 weeks. "Fencing took longer than I figured," said the voice, and Augusta, without particularly meaning to, paid attention to it. It was a measured voice. Not loud, not quick. The kind of voice that did not need to fill a room because it was comfortable enough with whatever space it already occupied. She went back to the shelves and did not look around the corner. She heard them talking, Calvin ordering supplies, rope and salt and a bag of coffee beans and a pair of work gloves, and she heard Harold say, "Oh, you haven't met our new bookkeeper. Augusta, come out and meet Calvin Walden." She had 2 options. She could pretend not to hear, which was rude and would require explanation later, or she could walk around the corner, shake hands, and return to the shelves within 90 seconds. She chose the second option. Calvin Walden was standing at the counter with his hat in his hands, and he was perhaps 32 or 33 years old, with the kind of face that outdoor work made weathered and honest, with lines around the eyes from squinting into sun, and a jaw that had seen rough shaves and not minded. He was tall, lean without being thin, with the particular self-possession of a man who spent most of his time outdoors and in his own company. His eyes, when they met hers, were a steady gray-green, and they held her gaze without any of the curious probing she had come to dread from strangers who sensed that there was a story being kept from them. "Miss Garrison," he said and nodded, and that was all. "Mr. Walden," she said, and nodded back. Harold, perhaps sensing the brevity of the introduction, launched into a speech about Augusta's excellent work on the accounts, during which Augusta and Calvin both stood quietly and waited for it to end. When it did, Calvin said it was nice to meet her, and Augusta said likewise, and she went back to the shelves. That was it. That was the first meeting, and it lasted perhaps 3 minutes and was not remarkable in any external way. But Augusta noticed afterward that he had not looked at her the way most men looked at a woman alone in a new town, not with pity or speculation or the particular kind of interest that came wrapped in condescension. He had looked at her the way one person looks at another person evenly, without agenda. She found herself thinking about it more than was strictly necessary, and then she made herself stop. The weeks continued. October settled properly into Harlan Creek, and the mornings turned sharp, and Augusta fell into a routine that suited her. She woke early. She worked on the accounts until the store opened. She helped Harold with customers through the busy hours of the morning. She ate lunch at her desk and went back to the books in the afternoon. In the evening she sometimes walked to the edge of town where the desert opened up and the mountains stood far in the blue distance, and she breathed the cold air and watched the sky change colors and tried, quietly and without much success, to locate whatever part of herself had existed before the war and see if it was still there. Thomas had been her closest companion, not just her brother, her dearest friend. He had been 22 when he enlisted, 2 years older than Augusta, and she had watched him ride away on a gray horse in the spring of 1862, with his whole bright future arranged before him like a deck of unplayed cards. He had been killed at Chancellorsville in 1863, and Augusta had been working as a nurse in a field hospital not 40 miles away, and she had learned of it through a letter that took 3 weeks to reach her, written by a man she did not know, who said Thomas had been brave and that she should be proud. She had been proud. She had also been destroyed. After the war she had gone back to what was left of the family home. Her mother had died of fever in '64. Her father had lost the property to debt, and she had lived with a cousin in Richmond for 2 years and worked and saved and tried to put herself back together. And eventually she had decided that Virginia was the problem, that every road and every face and every flowering tree reminded her of something she was grieving. And she had written to the Employment Bureau in St. Louis and asked to be placed as far west as possible. The West, it turned out, did not erase grief, but it contained it differently. The scale of the landscape made personal suffering feel appropriately small. The sky was too large to be haunted. She had not let anyone touch her hand since the war, not a deliberate decision, not a vow, but a consequence. Hands had come to mean things during those years that they had not meant before. Her hands had done things that she had needed to do and that she had never fully forgiven herself for, and the hands of others had. She stopped the thought there, the way she always did, at the edge of what she was willing to remember. People in Harlan Creek had mostly learned not to try. She did not shake hands when she could avoid it. She did not take offered arms. She kept her hands in her pockets when she was not working with them. Most people noticed and forgot about it. It was Nevada in 1873, and everyone had their peculiarities, and there were bigger things to worry about than whether the bookkeeper at the general store liked to keep her hands to herself. Calvin Walden came back to the store about twice a month, usually on Wednesdays. He was not a man who talked for the sake of talking, which Augusta respected. He would exchange a few words with Harold, collect what he needed, and go. Occasionally he would say something to Augusta if she was near, a brief observation about the weather, a question about whether Harold had gotten any new rope in, something practical and unpretentious. She would answer in the same register, and that would be the end of it. She did not think of it as the beginning of anything. She was not, at that point in her life, thinking in terms of beginnings. What changed things or began to change things was the first snow. It came in November, earlier than expected, A proper serious snowfall that settled over Harlan Creek in the night and left everything white and muffled and strange in the morning. Augusta stood at her window and looked at it and felt, unexpectedly, something that was not grief. It was not exactly joy either. It was more like recognition. The snow covering the desert the way snow covered Virginia, indiscriminate and clean, and something in her chest shifted slightly, like a door on a rusted hinge that has not been opened in years and has begun to wonder if it could be. She went down to start on the accounts and found Calvin Walden standing at the counter with Harold, both of them looking at the snow through the store window, with the expressions of men calculating what it meant for their respective enterprises. "Lost 3 calves last winter," Calvin was saying. "Storm came up fast and I didn't get them into the lower pasture in time." "Early snow's a bad sign," Harold said. "Could be worse. Could be a dry year." Harold noticed Augusta on the stairs. "Good morning, coffee's on, help yourself." Calvin turned, and there was that look again, even, unhurried, without agenda. "Miss Garrison." "Good morning, Mr. Walden," she said, and moved toward the small stove in the back where Harold kept a battered coffee pot. She poured herself a cup and stood with it, looking at the snow outside, and was aware without looking that Calvin had moved from the counter to stand a few feet away, also looking at the snow. They stood in a companionable quiet that was not uncomfortable, which itself was unusual. Augusta was used to silences that felt like pressure, like the other person was waiting for her to fill them. This silence did not feel like that. "You're from the East," he said. It was not a question. "Virginia," she said. He nodded once slowly, and she knew that he understood without her having to say more what Virginia meant, and what kind of years Virginia had contained for the people who had lived there during the war. He did not press and he did not offer condolences, which she was grateful for, because condolences, however well meant, were a form of being touched. "This your first Western winter?" he asked. "Yes." "It's different from what you're used to. The cold out here is drier. The snow doesn't stick the same way. It can be a foot deep and gone in 2 days." "That sounds easier," she said. "Easier in some ways, harder in others." He paused. "The wind is the thing. The wind out here gets serious." She found herself looking at him sideways. He was watching the snow with a quiet attention, as though he found the world genuinely interesting and worth looking at, which she had observed was not as common a quality as one might expect. "Have you always ranched?" she asked, and was slightly surprised to find herself asking. He seemed slightly surprised too, though he covered it smoothly. "My father did. I came west in '66, she calculated, after the war, like her." "From where?" "Ohio," he said. She turned that over. Ohio had been Union territory, obviously, but she found she did not feel the old flicker of something complicated that she sometimes felt around that fact. He had come west in '66 and was running a ranch in Nevada in 1873, and whatever had brought him west was his own story, and he was clearly not about to volunteer it any more than she was going to volunteer hers. "The accounts look like they're going to keep you busy," he said after a moment, gesturing vaguely toward the back office. "They were quite chaotic when I started," she admitted. "Harold is a wonderful merchant, but he is not a natural bookkeeper." The corner of Calvin's mouth moved in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "No, he's not." He reached for his hat, which was on the counter. "Good luck with the snow, Miss Garrison." "And with your calves, Mr. Walden," she said. He put the hat on and walked out into the white morning, and Augusta stood with her coffee and watched the door close behind him, and noticed that she had, in fact, spoken quite a number of unnecessary words and had not found it entirely unpleasant. She did not examine this too closely. She went back to the accounts, but she found, over the following weeks, that she was paying attention in a way she had not permitted herself since arriving in Harlan Creek. She noticed things. She noticed when Calvin's horse was tied outside during a cold snap, and the visit lasted longer than usual because Harold and Calvin had gotten into a discussion about whether the new railroad survey was going to affect land prices in the county. She noticed that Calvin always greeted the precise dog by name. The dog was called Biscuit, an undignified name for a hound, and Calvin delivered it with the same straight-faced seriousness with which he said everything else. She noticed that he brought Dot a jar of honey once, wild honey he'd found on the ridge of his eastern pasture, and that he handed it over with no particular ceremony, as if giving someone honey was simply what a person did when they happened to find some. She noticed that he never asked her questions she didn't want to answer. She noticed that she was noticing. December came, and with it the particular quiet of a small western town settling in for winter. The stage came less frequently. People stayed close to their fires. The mountains to the east turned a deep blue-white, and the desert floor crackled with frost each morning, and the sky was the hard, brilliant blue of a cold that has committed itself fully. Augusta was walking back from the telegraph office one afternoon in mid-December when she slipped on a patch of ice in the road. She caught herself before she fell, just barely, arms windmilling for a moment, satchel swinging, and stood there for a second with her heart hammering and her hands out, feeling extraordinarily foolish. "Are you all right?" she turned. Calvin Walden was across the road leading his horse, and he had stopped. He was not rushing over. He was not already reaching for her arm. He was asking from a respectful distance whether she was all right and waiting for her answer before he did anything else. She pulled herself straight. "Yes, thank you, foolish ice. It's everywhere this morning," he said. "Froze overnight, all that melt from yesterday." He crossed the road toward her but stopped a few feet away, still holding his horse's lead. "You heading back to Persix?" "Yes. The section in front of the farriers is the worst. If you go on the far side of the road past the water trough, it's a bit better." She had not known this. She would not have known to ask. "Thank you," she said, and meant it more than the words indicated. He nodded once and went on with his horse, and Augusta went on toward Persix, and she went carefully around the far side of the road past the water trough as he had said, and the footing was, in fact, considerably better. It was such a small thing. She thought about it in the evenings more than she ought to have. She thought about it because it was the shape of the thing, the fact that he had not reached for her, had not assumed she needed help, had offered information instead of hands. She thought about it because somewhere in the translation of that small exchange was a form of understanding that she could not quite account for, a sense that he had somehow, without any discussion, grasped the outline of who she was. She was being foolish. She told herself this firmly and went back to the accounts. It was Dot who first spoke plainly about it, the way Dot spoke plainly about most things. They were in the kitchen at the back of the Persix house on a Sunday in late December, making Christmas cookies that Dot distributed to the whole town as a matter of annual custom. And Dot said, without preamble and without looking up from her rolling pin, "Calvin Walden is a good man." Augusta looked up from the cookie cutter she was pressing into the dough. "I'm sure he is," she said carefully. "He lost his wife," Dot said. 3 years ago, fever. They had only been married 18 months. Augusta set down the cookie cutter. "I'm sorry to hear that," she said, and she was genuinely, in the way she felt sorry for any grief she recognized as real. "He took it hard. Didn't come to town for months. Just worked and worked until his foreman, that's Pete Grady, he's a good hand, until Pete practically dragged him in to buy supplies." Dot flattened a section of dough with firm, experienced strokes. "He's been on his own since. 3 years now. He's 33. Augusta returned to her cookie cutter and said nothing. "He looks at you," Dot said, "when you're not looking." "Dot," Augusta said, "I'm just saying." Dot was entirely unrepentant. "I'm just making an observation." "He's a polite man," Augusta said. "He greets everyone when they come in. He doesn't look at everyone the way he looks at you." Dot set down her rolling pin and turned to face Augusta with the direct kindness of a woman who had been married happily for 30 years and believed that other people deserved the same. "I don't know what happened to you, Augusta. I don't know what you've been carrying around since the war, and I'm not asking you to tell me. But I know the look of a person who has been very carefully making sure they feel as little as possible, and I know what it looks like when something starts to get through." Augusta held very still. "All I'm saying," Dot said, returning to her rolling pin, is that some men are worth letting in, and some women deserve to be found again. The kitchen was warm and smelled of cinnamon and butter, and Augusta looked at the cookie dough and thought about Thomas and thought about the war and thought about Calvin Walden crossing the road with his horse and asking, from a respectful distance, whether she was all right, and waiting for her answer before he did anything else. She did not say anything to Dot, but she did not argue either. Christmas in Harlan Creek was a modest affair, community-minded and practical. The church put on a service. Dot distributed cookies. Ned Calhoun at the saloon put out a special dinner and charged fair prices for it. People came together with the straightforward warmth of a small town that understood its own smallness and had decided to find it meaningful rather than limiting. Augusta went to the church service and sat in the back and felt the old grief move through her in the way it always did at Christmas. Thomas had loved Christmas, had been the kind of man who strung ribbons on everything and sang carols badly and loudly and with great enthusiasm. She sat with it, the grief, and let it pass, the way she had learned to let it pass. She was getting better at that, she thought, not at not feeling it, at feeling it and remaining standing. She saw Calvin across the church. He was near the front beside his foreman Pete Grady and Pete's wife, a sturdy, cheerful woman named Mabel. And for a moment their eyes met across the heads of the congregation and he nodded at her once, the same even, unhurried nod, and she nodded back, and it was nothing at all, and it was somehow also something. After the service she walked home through the cold, clear night, and the stars over Nevada were extraordinary a spectacle she had not been prepared for when she arrived, and that still took her breath somewhat. And she stood outside the store for a moment looking up at them and felt, tentatively and almost cautiously, something that was not grief and not numbness. She was not sure she had a name for it. She let it be unnamed and went inside. January arrived with serious cold and a second substantial snowfall, and a delivery of new ledger books for the store, which gave Augusta a proper organizational project to occupy herself with. She was in the middle of this reorganization on a Tuesday morning when Calvin came in, a Tuesday, not his usual Wednesday, which was unusual enough that Harold commented on it. "Early this week," Harold said. "Pete's taken sick," Calvin said. "Needed to pick up some things for him." He set a short list on the counter: medicine from the doc's supplies that Harold sometimes kept, broth ingredients, the particular tea that Pete swore by. "Nothing serious," Mabel says, "just a bad cold. But he's running a proper fever and she won't let him up." "Good for Mabel," Harold said. "Send him my regards." Calvin collected his supplies and turned, and found Augusta had come out from behind the stack of ledger books to retrieve something from the shelf behind the counter. They were in fairly close proximity, closer than usual, and she was aware of it in the careful, precise way she was aware of most physical proximity, the quiet internal alertness that she had lived with for years. But he simply stepped back a little, making space, not drawing attention to it, and said, "How's the reorganization going?" "Slowly," she said, "but accurately." "Accuracy is worth the slowness," he said. She almost smiled. She was aware of almost smiling. "That's a generous view." "It's a practical one," he said. "Wrong numbers have a way of compounding. Better to be slow and right." She looked at him directly, for perhaps a moment longer than she usually permitted herself. He had snow on his coat, not yet fully melted, and his hat was pushed back slightly in the way it went when he was warm from a cold ride. His eyes were that steady gray-green, and they were meeting hers without any particular agenda, and she thought, distantly, as if from a great remove, that Dot Persick was probably right about quite a few things. "Is Pete likely to be out long?" she asked, because she wanted to keep talking and this was a practical question. 3 or 4 days, Mabel hopes. He picked up his bundle from the counter. "Means I'm doing his work and mine for a bit, longer days." "I hope he recovers quickly," she said. "So do I," Calvin said, and there was genuine warmth in it, the warmth of a man who cared about his foreman's welfare as a human matter, not just as an inconvenience to his workload. "Good luck with the ledgers, Miss Garrison." "Thank you, Mr. Walden," she said, and he went out into the snow. She stood with a ledger book in her hands and noticed that her heart was beating at a rate that was not entirely explained by the exertion of retrieving something from a shelf. Pete recovered in 5 days, and Calvin came in the following Wednesday looking less strained, and reported that Pete was back on his feet and insufferable about it. A word that Augusta suspected meant something quite different from its technical definition in this context, something closer to beloved. February was cold and long, and the town contracted around its fires, and Augusta and Calvin accumulated small exchanges the way a river accumulates small stones, individually unremarkable, collectively changing the shape of the landscape. He told her about the ranch. Not all at once, not in any confessional or deliberate way, but in pieces, the way a person speaks who is accustomed to their own company and finds it unexpectedly natural to speak to someone particular. The cattle, the land, the problem of the eastern fence, the way the light came over the ridge in the mornings and turned the whole valley gold for about 15 minutes before becoming simply daylight. She told him small things too. About the ledgers, about the differences she was noticing between Eastern and Western commerce, about a book she was reading, one of Twain's, which Harold stocked, and which she was finding unexpectedly funny. She told him about the cookies that Dot made and the particular satisfaction of categorizing a chaotic set of accounts into clean order. She did not tell him about Thomas. She did not tell him about the war or the field hospital or the things she had seen and done. She did not tell him about her hands, but she was talking. She was talking to Calvin Walden in a way that she had not talked to anyone since before the war, and while she noted this with considerable caution, she also noted that it did not feel like something she was doing wrong. March came, and the thaw began, and the world started to remember that it was capable of color. The desert in the early spring of Nevada was extraordinary in its way, not green, not lush, but alive with something that looked like determination, tiny flowers pushing up through cracked earth, the smell of sage after rain sharp and medicinal and strangely hopeful. On a morning in early March, a Wednesday, Calvin came into the store, and Harold was out making a delivery to the schoolhouse, which Miss Prentice had ordered supplies for, and Dot was in the kitchen at the back of the house. Augusta was at the counter, managing the morning's orders. Calvin came in and the bell sounded and he said good morning and she said good morning, and he looked at the counter and seemed to notice Harold's absence with a brief glance around the store. "Harold's at the school," Augusta offered. "Ah," he said. He set his list on the counter. He had coffee beans on the list, and she went to measure them out, working with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing this for months now. He waited at the counter, not talking, not fidgeting, simply present in the easy way he occupied space. The coffee beans measured and bagged. She brought them to the counter along with the rest of his supplies, and she was tallying the total in her head. She was faster at this than Harold had ever needed to be when he said, "Would you like to come and see the ranch?" She looked up. He was not looking at her with any of the things she feared finding, not with pressure or presumption or the specific hope that wants something it has not been offered. He was looking at her evenly, as always, and there was a quietness in the invitation that acknowledged she might say no without requiring an explanation. "There's a section of the eastern pasture," he said, "where in March the wildflowers come up on the ridge. It's something to see. Pete and Mabel ride out to look at them every year. I thought you might—" He paused, brief and measured. "It's a good morning for a ride if you're inclined." She thought about it. She thought about Thomas, who had loved wildflowers. She thought about the thing in her chest that had been loosening incrementally, like a fist that had been clenched so long it had forgotten there were other positions. "I haven't been on a horse in some time," she said. "I have a gentle mare," he said. "She won't put you in any trouble." She set down the pen she had been holding. "I would need to be back before Harold returns," she said. "Of course," he said. 2 hours, maybe 3. We'd be back well before noon." She looked at the accounts, which were perfectly in order and did not need her. She looked at the door, which led to the street, which led to the desert, which led to a ridge where wildflowers were apparently blooming in March and which she had never seen. She looked at Calvin Walden, who was waiting without pressing. "All right," she said. The mare was called Clover, a name that suited her completely. A placid gray animal with large liquid eyes and an attitude toward life that suggested nothing in the world was particularly surprising or alarming. Augusta settled into the saddle more naturally than she had expected, the old muscle memory reasserting itself, and Calvin rode beside her on a bay gelding called Real, a more energetic horse that he handled with the casual ease of a man who had spent years on horseback. They rode out of town on the main road and then turned north onto a packed dirt track that wound through the desert toward the ridge. The morning was clear and the air was cold but warming, and the sage smelled powerful after a night of light rain, and the sky was the particular brilliant blue that Nevada reserved for mornings that had earned it. They did not talk for the first part of the ride, and the silence was entirely comfortable. Augusta breathed the cold air and felt the movement of the horse beneath her and was aware, in the way she was rarely aware of things, of being present not in the past, not in Virginia, not in a field hospital in 1863. Here, in the desert on a horse in the March of 1874. "Your father was a rancher?" she asked, when the silence had settled enough that speech felt natural. "Farmer," Calvin said. "Wheat. He wanted me to take it over. I couldn't make myself want to. He was quiet for a beat. Ohio didn't suit me after the war." She absorbed this. He had been in the war. She had not known this, had suspected perhaps from the way he wore his silences, but had not known. "Where did you serve?" she asked, and the question felt significant in a way she could not quite name, asking it. "Virginia mostly," he said. "The last 2 years." He did not elaborate, and she understood that the elaboration was not available, that it lived in the same sealed place where her own elaboration lived. "You were there during the war?" he asked. "I was a nurse," she said, "for 2 years." He was quiet for a moment. "That's hard work," he said simply, without the exclamation of surprised respect that she sometimes received, which always felt like being looked at through glass. He said it the way someone says something that they know to be true and consider self-evident. "Yes," she said, "it was." And that was all. They rode on, and the ridge began to slope up, and the track became narrower, and around a stand of twisted juniper the ridge opened out, and Augusta saw the wildflowers. They were extraordinary. She had not expected them to be so extraordinary. The whole face of the ridge was thick with them, small and riotous, gold and purple, and a deep vivid yellow, pressing up through the rocky soil with the stubborn exuberance of things that had survived winter and were not modest about it. The morning light caught them, and the whole ridge seemed to glow slightly, warm against the blue sky and the red rock, and Augusta stopped Clover at the edge of it and simply looked. She was not going to cry. She was absolutely not going to cry. She breathed carefully and felt the tightness in her chest that she had learned was grief finding its way out through other passages. Beauty, sometimes, had a way of reaching the same place that sorrow reached and hitting it from the opposite direction. "Thomas loved wildflowers," she said, and was startled to find she had said it aloud. Calvin looked at her. He did not say anything immediately, which she appreciated. "My brother," she said. "He was killed at Chancellorsville." "I'm sorry," Calvin said, and it was the plainest possible version of those words, without embellishment, without the reaching quality that condolences sometimes had. He simply said it as a statement of genuine sorrow for a genuine loss, and it did not feel like being touched. "He would have liked this," she said, looking at the flowers. "He was that kind of person." "What kind of person?" Calvin asked, and the question was not prying. It was an invitation, with a door she could close. She thought about it. She thought about Thomas running through their mother's garden with ribbons in his hands at Christmas. Thomas singing badly and loudly in church, and making their mother press her lips together to hold in the laugh. Thomas writing her long, rambling letters full of strange observations about the world and declarations that the coffee in the army was unconscionable, and that after the war he intended to drink nothing but good coffee for the rest of his life. "The kind who finds things worth noticing," she said. Everywhere he went, he found something worth noticing and pointed at it. Calvin was quiet for a moment. "Those are the best kind," he said at last. They stayed on the ridge for nearly an hour, longer than Augusta had planned and long enough that she would have been concerned about Harold's return if she had been keeping careful track of time, which she found she was not. They talked more than they usually did, not dramatically, not confessionally, but steadily, the conversation of two people who are discovering that they enjoy each other's company and are willing to stay a little longer in it than strictly necessary. He told her about the ranch, the particular problems and the particular pleasures of it, the way a calf born in winter needed watching, the sound the wind made coming through the eastern pasture in summer, the way the stars over the high desert were different from the stars anywhere else he had been. She told him about the Ledgers, yes, but also about Charlottesville before the war, the garden, the house, the way Virginia looked in May. And it was the first time she had spoken of it without the weight of what came after pressing down on every word. When they rode back down the ridge and turned toward town, Augusta felt something that she had forgotten was available to her, the simple, clean, uncomplicated feeling of having spent time well. She was back at the store before Harold returned. April came, and the wildflowers retreated, but the desert grew greener, and Augusta found herself riding to the ridge again, not with Calvin initially, but alone, on a horse she borrowed from the livery, because she wanted to see the place again, and because she was beginning to understand that wanting things was something she was allowed to do. She mentioned this ride to Calvin the next Wednesday, and he asked if she had gone up to the north face where the red rock formations were, and she had not, and he offered to show her, and she said yes. These rides became, over April and into May, a regular occurrence. Not every week, not by any formal arrangement. They were not formal people, either of them, but often enough that Harlan Creek, being a small town, noticed and formed its own opinions. Presic said nothing to Augusta about it beyond a particular smile that expressed a great deal. Miss Prentice, the schoolteacher, mentioned at the general store, in what was clearly intended as a casual aside, that Calvin Walden was generally considered the most honest man in the county. Pete Grady's wife, Mabel, stopped Augusta in the street one morning to say that Pete thought the world of Calvin and that she ought to know it. Augusta accepted these observations with the self-possession of a woman who has decided to let something happen at its own pace and is not going to be hurried by the sociable enthusiasm of her community. What she was less prepared for was her own pace, which was, she was discovering, faster than she had expected. It was not that she was not cautious. She was extremely cautious. She noticed everything, noticed when Calvin was in a quieter mood and did not press, noticed when he chose words with a particular care that suggested he was being honest about something difficult, noticed the quality of his attention, the way he listened to what she said rather than waiting for her to stop talking so he could speak. She noticed that he never made assumptions about her or about what she could manage or what she needed. She noticed that he was a patient man in the specific way that distinguished patience from passivity. He was not waiting around. He was simply not in a hurry. She noticed that she wanted to see him. That on the days when he came to the store she was not nervous exactly, aware, alert in a way that was not unpleasant. She noticed all of this and held it carefully, the way you hold something fragile that you are not yet sure you can afford to have. In May, on a Sunday afternoon when they had ridden out to the north face of the ridge and were sitting on a flat rock looking out over the valley, Calvin said, "You're staying in Harlan Creek, then?" She looked at him. "Did you think I might not be?" "When you first came," he said, looking out over the valley rather than at her, "you had the look of someone passing through." She considered this. It was true that she had arrived without any strong intention to stay permanently. She had arrived with the intention of existing, which was slightly different. "And now," she asked, He looked at her then, the steady gray-green look. Now it looks different. She held his gaze for a moment, then looked out at the valley. The afternoon light was long and golden, and below them the town was a scatter of buildings and smoke columns, and beyond it the desert stretched out to where the mountains caught the light and turned rose and copper. "I've been thinking about opening a proper office," she said. "There are several businesses in town that need proper bookkeeping. Harold barely needs me full-time anymore, the accounts are in order, but the farrier and the doctor and the school board have no one to manage their records, and She paused. "I've been thinking about it." "That seems right," Calvin said, "for Harlan Creek and for you." She liked that he had said it that way, not just for the town, not just for her, but both. "You think the town would use such a service?" "I know the town would," he said. "And I know," he paused, the brief measured pause she had learned to recognize as him choosing words carefully, "that I would. The ranch accounts are a disaster. I'm worse at it than Harold was." She laughed. It came out of her with a surprise that was itself surprising, a genuine laugh, full and unguarded. She had not laughed like that in a very long time, and the sound of it hung in the warm air for a moment, and Calvin was looking at her with an expression that she was not quite able to read, something that was careful and warm simultaneously, like a lantern with a glass shade. "I can tell you exactly what I charge," she said, once she had recovered herself. "Somehow," he said, "I don't think that was ever really about the accounts." The silence that followed was the most significant silence they had shared, because it was the kind of silence that acknowledges something out loud without any of the words being spoken. Augusta looked at her hands, resting on the rock beside her. Her hands. She had worn gloves today, as she often did, not because of the cold. May was warm enough, but because it was habit, because it was protective, because the gloves were a small, manageable boundary. She took them off. She did not think about it particularly. It was warm, and she had been wearing them out of habit, and the rock was warm beneath her palms and the air was sweet, and she simply took the gloves off and set them beside her. Calvin said nothing. He did not look at her hands. He continued to look out at the valley, but she was aware that something had shifted, some small interior thing, some almost imperceptible readjustment of the walls she had built and maintained and called, for years, survival. She put her hands back in her lap and looked at the valley alongside him, and the afternoon continued, golden and warm, and the mountains turned rose and then a deep amber, and then the color that has no name that the western sky makes at the end of a clear day. June arrived, and Augusta opened her bookkeeping office in a small space next to the telegraph office that Harold helped her rent at a fair rate. She put a hand-lettered sign in the window, "Augusta Garrison, Accounts and Records," and within 2 weeks she had 4 clients, and within a month she had 7, and she was busier than she had been at the general store, and also, she recognized, more genuinely herself in the work, because it was her enterprise and her name on the door and her own. Calvin brought his ranch accounts to her on a Tuesday in late June. He brought them in a wooden box, an actual wooden box, papers loose and tumbling about inside it, and set the box on her desk and looked at it with an expression of mild, accepting shame. "It's worse than Harold's was," she said, having lifted the lid. "Probably," he said. "It's going to take me at least 3 sessions to sort this," she said. "I'll pay extra for the distress," he said, and there was that almost smile again, that slight movement at the corner of his mouth. "You will," she agreed firmly, and he laughed, a real laugh, low and warm, which she had not heard before, and which turned out to be the kind of sound that a person could find themselves thinking about later in the evening for no particular practical reason. She sorted his accounts over 3 weeks, with him coming in on Tuesday afternoons to answer questions about specific entries, and to generally provide what he called clarification, and what she was privately calling educated guessing. These sessions were an hour, sometimes more, and they sat across the desk from each other and talked about numbers and occasionally about other things. And the office was warm in the afternoons, with the western sun coming through the window. And Augusta found these Tuesday afternoons to be the part of the week she looked forward to most, which was information she filed carefully in the same part of her mind, where she kept all the information about Calvin Walden that she was not quite ready to act on. On the fourth Tuesday, she had finished the accounts and had a clean set of ledgers to present him. She went through them methodically, explaining her system. She always explained her system so that clients understood their own records, and he listened with genuine attention, asking sensible questions, and when she was done, he looked at the neat columns with an expression that might have been described as reverent. "That's remarkable," he said. "It's arithmetic," she said. "It's more than arithmetic." He looked at her across the desk. "You made order out of complete chaos. That's a talent." She folded her hands on the desk and looked back at him and said, before she had made any conscious decision to say it, "I had a great deal of practice during the war, making order out of chaos." She paused. It was the only thing that helped, finding a system, finding a way to sort what could be sorted. She breathed. "The rest, the things that couldn't be sorted, those I learned to put away." He was very still. "Does it stay put?" he asked. "The things you put away?" "Mostly," she said. "More now than it used to." He held her gaze for a moment, and there was something in his expression that she recognized because she had felt it from the inside, the recognition of a person who has carried something heavy for a long time and has learned to carry it, and knows that the carrying does not go away but that it can become less all-consuming. "Same," he said, very quietly. That was the conversation. That was all of it. But afterward she sat in the warm afternoon light of her office and felt that something had been given and something had been received, and that both parties had walked away with rather more than they had come in with. July was hot, and the town slowed in the heat the way towns do when the sun is serious about itself. Augusta kept shorter office hours in the worst of the afternoon heat, and took to sitting on the small bench outside her door in the early mornings when the air was still cool and working through her correspondence. Calvin rode into town less frequently in July. The summer work on the ranch was pressing, he explained, and he sent a note with Pete when he couldn't come in person, asking quick questions about the accounts that she answered in writing and sent back with Pete. And she found herself looking forward to Pete's Tuesday arrivals perhaps more than was strictly professional. On an evening in mid-July, there was a celebration in Harlan Creek, some confluence of a visiting official and a successful water rights agreement, and the general human desire to make a party when the opportunity presented itself. Ned Calhoun cleared tables from the saloon's main room and put a fiddle player in the corner and called it a dance, and the whole town came. Augusta went because Dot asked her to, and she had learned that refusing Dot was both difficult and somewhat pointless. She wore the blue dress that she had brought from Virginia and had not worn since arriving in Harlan Creek, and she looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand in her room above the store. She still kept the room, even though her office had a small chamber off the back that she could have slept in, and thought that she looked like someone who had spent time outdoors and gotten some color back in her face, and who perhaps looked less like a woman who had been surviving and more like a woman who was beginning to do something else. The dance was warm and loud and cheerful with the uncomplicated pleasure of a small community that has made its own entertainment. Augusta stood with Dot and sipped lemonade and watched the dancing and felt not lonely, exactly, not the old grinding loneliness, but something adjacent to it that was milder and had a different quality, more like wishing than like loss. Calvin came in about an hour into the evening, with Pete and Mabel, still in his work clothes but with his hair combed and his hat left outside. He found Augusta before he found anyone else. She was aware of the moment he walked in, and she was aware of the moment he saw her across the room, and the moment between those two events was perhaps 3 seconds, and she counted every one of them with the precision she applied to ledger columns. He made his way to her, stopping briefly to greet people as he crossed the room, and arrived at her corner with a directness that did not seem intentional but clearly was. "Miss Garrison," he said. "Mr. Walden," she said. He looked at the dancing and they stood companionably and watched it for a moment, and then he said, "Would you like to dance?" She thought about it. She thought about his hands. She thought about what it would mean to take them. "I might be out of practice," she said. "So might I," he said. She looked at him. The fiddle was playing something waltz-like, which was easier than the quick dances, and the floor was not too crowded, and Calvin was looking at her with his level, patient look that said he would not be offended if she said no, but that he would very much like it if she said yes. "All right," she said. They moved to the edge of the dancing, and Calvin turned to face her and offered his hand. The gesture was simple and entirely conventional. One hand offered for hers, the other ready to go to her waist, and it should have been entirely routine. But she looked at his hand and she felt the old familiar tightening in her chest, the full-body alertness that was not quite fear and not quite grief but was the compound residue of both, and she almost stepped back. She did not step back. She put her hand in his. Their fingers met, and it was, for a moment, the most enormous thing she had experienced in years. Not painful, not frightening, just enormous. His hand was warm and dry and steady, and he held hers with a firmness that did not grip and a care that was entirely without performance, and she felt the warmth of it travel up her arm and settle somewhere in the center of her chest. She breathed. He was watching her face, and she knew he saw something there, that the moment had not been invisible to him. He said nothing. He simply kept holding her hand, and the music played and they danced. She had not let anyone touch her hand since the war, and now she was dancing, and her hand was in his, and the world had not ended. In fact, the world seemed, for the duration of that first dance and the second one that followed, to be quite specifically and deliberately beautiful. Afterward, they had danced twice and then stepped off the floor and stood talking until the evening grew late and people began to drift home. Calvin walked her back to the store. They walked through the warm dark of the July night, not touching, the space between them comfortable, and stopped at the store door, and she turned to face him. "Thank you for the dances," she said. "Thank you for agreeing to them," he said. She looked at him in the dark. The stars were the Nevada stars, enormous and indifferent and beautiful. The street was quiet now, most of the town heading home with the good tiredness of people who have spent an evening well. "Calvin," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and she both heard it and felt it, the intimacy of it. He heard it too. Something in his face shifted slightly, like the change in light when a cloud passes. "Augusta," he said, and the sound of her name in his voice was something she was entirely unprepared for. She breathed. She stopped. She tried again. "I have not been an easy person to know," she said. "Since the war, I'm aware of that. I have kept a considerable distance from most things." "I know," he said gently, "and I'm aware that you've been patient." She met his eyes. "More patient than you had any obligation to be." "It wasn't patience," he said. "It was," he paused, choosing, as always, his words with care. "It was wanting to know you on whatever terms you needed." Her chest was very tight and very warm simultaneously. "I wanted you to know," she said, that it's been a long time since anything has felt like this." She stopped, slightly alarmed by her own frankness. He was quiet for a moment. The night was soft around them, warm and still. "Since anything has felt like what?" he asked, and there was a particular quality to the question, not pushing, not demanding, but genuinely needing to hear the answer. She looked at him. She had been cautious and careful and measured for so many years that saying it felt like stepping off a ridge, not without fear but freely chosen. "Like possibility," she said. The word fell between them and settled there, and Calvin looked at it, or seemed to, and then he looked at her and said, very quietly, "That's the same for me." She nodded once. She understood that they were not going to rush this, that they were both people who had been through enough to know the value of measured steps, but she also understood that something had changed, that the question of what they were to each other had moved from the category of the unnamed into something that was beginning to have a shape. She said good night and went inside and stood at the bottom of the stairs in the dark and pressed her hand against her chest and felt her own heartbeat, which was strong and steady and very much present. August came and was magnificent and relentless and all-consuming, the Nevada summer doing its most serious work, and Augusta settled into a life that she recognized, with something between amazement and gratitude, as genuinely hers. She had 6 steady clients. Her office was productive and she was respected in it. She had friends Mabel, Miss Prentice, who had turned out to be excellent company once she had stopped being afraid of the heat. She had a room she called her own, and a view she had come to love, and a desert that smelled of sage and possibility. And she had Calvin, not in any way that had been formally established. They had not spoken again of what had been said at the store door in July, at least not directly. But he came to town on Wednesdays and found reasons to stop at her office. They continued their rides. They sat together at the community suppers that organized. They talked, easily and increasingly, about things that mattered. She learned that he had been afraid after his wife had died that he was the kind of man who would not recover from it, not melodramatically, but in the practical sense that he had wondered if he was capable of opening himself to anything again. He told her this one afternoon on the ridge in a tone that was entirely even, as if reporting facts about the weather, and she understood that it cost him something to say it and that he was saying it anyway. "And now?" she asked. The same question he had asked her. "Now," he said, and looked at her, and did not finish the sentence because he did not need to. She reached out and put her hand over his where it rested on the rock, just briefly. A touch that lasted perhaps 5 seconds. But it was entirely deliberate and entirely chosen, and she felt the warmth of his hand under hers and the steadiness of it, and felt none of the things she had feared and all of the things she had hoped, quietly and without letting herself hope too loudly, she might feel. He turned his hand, and for a moment their fingers interlaced, warm and certain, and then she drew back and they went on talking about whatever it was they had been discussing. The accounts, she thought, or the wildflowers, or some book one of them had read. And the conversation resumed as if it had not been interrupted, but the afternoon had a different quality now, lit from the inside by something that had finally been acknowledged. September arrived, and with it the anniversary of Augusta's arrival in Harlan Creek. 1 year. She stood at her office window on the morning of September's first week, and thought about the woman who had gotten off the stage with her leather satchel clutched against her chest, and her hair pinned tight as a lid on something under pressure, and she felt toward that woman a tenderness that was new. That woman had survived. That woman had come all this way carrying all of that, and she had done it, and she had put herself in the way of something worth having, and had not run from it even when it frightened her. Thomas, she thought, would have found this worth noticing. Calvin asked her, at the end of a Wednesday in September, if she would come to supper at the ranch. Pete and Mabel were coming, he said, and he had gotten better at cooking since he'd been on his own, which was damning himself with faint praise, and he would understand entirely if she'd rather eat at Calhoun's where the food was guaranteed to be edible. He delivered this invitation with the same straight-faced practicality he delivered everything, and she laughed and said yes. The ranch was beautiful. She had expected something spare and functional, and it was spare and it was functional, but it was also honest, in the way that Calvin was honest. The house was low and solid, built well against the weather, with a wide front porch and windows that faced the ridge. Inside it was clean and simply furnished, and there were small signs of habitation that told her things she had not known, a shelf of books, more than she expected, battered and well-read. A rough watercolor of the valley tacked to the wall beside the fireplace, obviously amateur but clearly loved. A pair of spurs hung by the door that were too small for Calvin's feet, and that she understood from the way he did not mention them had belonged to someone. She did not mention them either. Supper was good, better than Calvin's self-deprecation had suggested. And Pete was funny, and Mabel was warm, and the evening had the easy pleasure of people who are comfortable with one another. After supper they sat on the porch, and the darkness came in over the ridge, and the stars appeared one by one and then all at once, and Mabel and Pete went inside eventually, and she and Calvin sat on the porch in the warm night and talked the way they always talked, easily, ranging across whatever the conversation wanted to find. At one point he said, "Do you know what I thought the first time I saw you?" She looked at him. "What?" "I thought you were the most self-contained person I had ever met," he said. "Not cold, I want to be clear about that. Not unfriendly, just complete, as if you didn't need anything else added. And now," she said, because it had become a kind of language between them, the completion of each other's questions in this particular way. "Now I know that's not quite it," he said. "You were protecting something. All that containment, it was protection." He looked at the stars. "I understood it. I was doing the same thing, just more visibly." She looked at him. "You didn't seem to be struggling," she said. "I was," he said. "I'm better at hiding things than I look like I should be. A beat. You seem to be getting through, regardless of the struggle." He paused. "That was something I hadn't seen in a while. Someone getting through." She looked at the stars over the ridge, the Nevada sky doing its particular magnificent thing, and she thought about the word through, not past, not over, not around, but through. She had been getting through, and he had been watching, not from pity but from a kind of recognition. "I didn't think I was getting through," she said. "I thought I was holding still." "Sometimes those look the same from the outside," he said, "but I don't think they feel the same." She considered this. "No," she said, "they don't." It was late when she rode back to town. He accompanied her, which she had expected, and they rode side by side under the stars and talked until the lights of Harlan Creek appeared below them. And at the edge of town he said good night, and she said good night and rode on alone down the main road. And she felt the word she had used in July, and it still applied. Possibility. But now it felt closer. Now it felt like something with a specific address. October arrived, and the anniversary of the first snow, and the town preparing for winter, and Augusta settled her office accounts and prepared for the slower months and thought about what she wanted and decided that wanting was an act she was ready to perform more openly. She wrote it out one evening at her desk, the way she wrote accounts, in clean column form, the way she understood things. What she knew, what she felt, what she wanted. She did not show it to anyone. She did not need to. The act of writing it was itself a kind of action, a formal declaration to herself that she was done with holding still and ready to move through. She was 30 years old. She had been through a war and a grief and a rebuilding. She had come across the country to a small town in Nevada and put her name on a door and opened an office and made a life. She had put her hand in a man's hand at a July dance and felt something clean and warm travel up her arm and into the center of her chest, and she had liked it, and she wanted more of it. She folded the paper and put it in the desk drawer and went to bed and slept well for the first time in recent memory. The next Wednesday, when Calvin came in for his accounts review, she was working through his September receipts, which were considerably better organized than his original box had been, largely because she had given him a system and he had actually followed it. She waited until the accounts were done, and the receipts were filed and the ledger was updated, and then she folded her hands on the desk and looked at him across it. "I have been thinking," she said. "About," he said, with the careful attention of a man who is aware that something significant might be approaching. "About what I want," she said, "which is something I haven't given proper thought to in quite a long time." Held his gaze. "I want to stay in Harlan Creek. I want my office. I want the rides to the ridge. I want the Tuesday afternoons going through your receipts, which are significantly better than they were." She paused. "And I want you, properly, with whatever that means going forward." The silence that followed was perhaps 10 seconds, and then Calvin leaned forward in his chair and said, "I have wanted to say something of that nature for the better part of a year, and I couldn't determine the right moment." "There isn't a right moment," she said. "I've been waiting for one, and I've decided there isn't one." "You're probably correct," he said, and he reached across the desk and offered his hand, palm up, the way he had offered it at the July dance. And this time there was no music and no crowd and nothing ceremonial, just the two of them in her warm office with the ledgers on the desk and the Nevada afternoon outside the window. She put her hand in his. Their fingers met, and the warmth was there, the steadiness, the specific rightness of it that she had been carrying with her since July, unnamed and growing. "I should also tell you," he said, holding her hand, that I intend to ask you to marry me. Not today, because I think that deserves a rather more considered occasion. But I want you to know that's the direction I'm heading." She looked at him. She felt the warmth from his hand and felt no desire at all to withdraw hers. "That's useful information," she said, which was perhaps not the most romantic possible response, and Calvin's almost smile became a full smile for perhaps the second time she had seen it, and it was remarkably good to look at. "Good," he said. He asked her on a Saturday in November, on the ridge, where the wildflowers were long gone, and the rock was cold beneath their feet, and the valley was dusted with a thin first snow. He had brought hot coffee in a flask, real coffee, good coffee, the kind Thomas had dreamed about, and poured it into 2 battered tin cups and handed her one, and their fingers met around the cup, and he looked at her over the steam and said, "Augusta, will you marry me?" It was not particularly eloquent. It did not need to be. She held the cup with both hands and looked at him and felt the heat of the coffee and the heat of his hands and the heat of the clear, cold day and said, "Yes." Obviously, yes. He laughed and she laughed, and they stood on the cold ridge with their bad tin cups and the enormous Nevada sky, and she felt something inside her that had been shut for 11 years open like a door long enough, closed that the air on the other side is entirely fresh and new. They were married in March, a year and 5 months after Augusta had stepped off the stage with her satchel clutched to her chest. The ceremony was at the Harlan Creek Church, performed by the minister who rode through every 2 weeks and who was visibly pleased to perform a function that did not involve a funeral. The whole town came, because the whole town was invited, because Harlan Creek was the kind of place that treated its own celebrations as common property, and because Prisick had organized everything within an inch of its life. Augusta wore a dress she had made herself, cream-colored, simple, practical enough for a woman who would be leaving the ceremony and riding back to a ranch, and she carried a handful of dried wildflowers from the ridge that she had pressed in the autumn and kept in a book on her desk. Calvin stood at the front of the church looking as though he was slightly amazed by his own good fortune, which Augusta found entirely acceptable. Pete Grady served as the best man. Dot served as the matron of honor, an appointment that made her so thoroughly happy that she cried through most of the service and was completely unapologetic about it. Harold Prisick made a speech afterward that was long and meandering and full of tangents, but fundamentally about love and about Harlan Creek, and about what it meant to make a place where people could find their way to something good, and it was entirely Harold and therefore entirely perfect. Augusta stood beside Calvin at the reception that Calhoun's hosted in its cleared dining room, and she held his hand openly, the way she had learned to hold his hand freely, without the old alertness, without the protective numbness. His hand was warm and dry and entirely familiar now, and she thought about the first time she had taken it and what it had cost her and what it had returned. Everything, she thought. It had returned everything. She did not think she was the same woman who had stepped off the stage in September 1873. She was not the same woman. She was something made of the same materials, perhaps, but assembled differently with the cracks, because there were still cracks, would always be cracks, filled with something other than silence. She carried Thomas with her as she would always carry Thomas, and she had told Calvin about him properly now, one winter evening by the fire at the ranch. The Christmas ribbons, the bad singing, the letters about unconscionable army coffee, and Calvin had listened with his whole attention and said that he sounded like the kind of person worth knowing, and she had said yes, exactly. That was exactly what he had been. The ranch was hers now, jointly. She kept her office in town, because it was hers, and because she was good at it, and because Calvin would not have suggested otherwise in 1,000 years. She rode out to the ranch on evenings that were not too dark and too cold, and she came to know the eastern pasture and the ridge and the way the light came over in the mornings and turned everything gold for 15 minutes, and she thought she understood why Calvin had never been able to make himself leave it. In the spring of 1875, Augusta's accounting practice had grown large enough that she needed to take on a part-time assistant, and she hired Miss Prentice's cousin, who had just arrived from Ohio looking for work, a sharp-minded young woman named Clara who caught on quickly, and whom Augusta taught the way she wished someone had taught her directly, and with the understanding that precision was a form of respect. In the spring of 1875, she also told Calvin that they were expecting a child. He stood in the kitchen of the ranch house with a completely blank expression for approximately 3 seconds, and then crossed the room and held her, and she held him back, and they stayed that way for a long moment in the kitchen that smelled of coffee and wood smoke, and she felt the warmth of him and the steadiness of him, and the specific, irreplaceable comfort of being held by someone you have chosen and who has chosen you. Their son was born in November of 1875, and they named him Thomas. He was a loud, healthy baby with Calvin's gray-green eyes and Augusta's dark hair, and a temperament that immediately suggested he would find everything worth noticing. Calvin held him with the same steady care with which he held everything that mattered to him, and Augusta watched from the bed where she was recovering, tired and aching and more content than she had thought she was capable of being, and felt something that she could only describe as complete. Not complete in the sense of finished, not in the sense that there was nothing more to want or need or work toward, but complete in the sense of whole. In the sense of all the pieces present, the broken ones and the healed ones, and the ones that would always bear the marks of what they had been through, all of them accounted for and held together. Dot came to see the baby the following afternoon and held him and said he was the finest baby she had ever seen, which she said about every baby she had ever seen and which was, in this case, more literally true than usual. "You look well," Dot said to Augusta, meaning something more than the physical. "I am," Augusta said. "I genuinely am." Dot patted her hand, both of them, simultaneously, with the warm competence of a woman who had been patting people's hands for 30 years, and Augusta did not flinch or tighten or pull back. She held still beneath the warmth of it and received it for what it was, an uncomplicated offering of love from someone who had been kind to her from the beginning and had not required her to be anything other than what she could manage. "Good," Dot said, satisfied, as if a long and somewhat complicated equation had finally resolved to the correct answer. Thomas Garrison Walden grew into exactly the kind of person his mother had hoped he might grow into, loud and curious and full of opinions about the world, inclined to point at things and demand to know about them, to find every corner of the ranch and every shelf in his mother's office worthy of thorough investigation. He had his grandfather Thomas's quality of finding things worth noticing, which Augusta observed with a heart so full it sometimes genuinely astonished her. A daughter arrived in 1878, 3 years after Thomas, and they named her Clara, after the woman who had helped Augusta manage her expanding practice, and Clara Walden turned out to be quieter than her brother and more precise, a miniature bookkeeper in temperament, as Calvin pointed out one evening, watching her arrange her toy blocks in very neat rows, and Augusta had laughed and said that was the finest compliment he could have paid her. Calvin's ranch prospered. The eastern fence problem was finally resolved when he ran a proper stone-footed replacement along the ridge, which took the better part of a summer, and resulted in Pete Grady saying it was the finest fence in the county, an assessment with which Calvin modestly agreed. The cattle operation expanded, moderately and practically, in the way that Calvin did everything without drama, with sound reasoning, with the quiet confidence of a man who trusts the land and his own capability to work it. Augusta's practice continued to grow, and by 1879 she had 2 full-time assistants and clients in 2 other towns reached by the stage, who sent their books to her and received them back in clean order. She was known, in the counties of that part of Nevada, as the finest bookkeeper available, and she was occasionally asked to settle accounting disputes that had grown contentious, a role she performed with a judicial impartiality that resolved things so definitively that both parties usually left satisfied, which she considered her greatest professional achievement. She thought about Virginia sometimes. She thought about her mother's garden and her father's house, and the way the Blue Ridge looked in May, and she let those thoughts arrive and pass, the way she had learned to let grief arrive and pass, without drowning in them. She had gone back once in 1877, just for a week. Calvin had come with her, and she had stood at the edge of what had been the family property and breathed the Virginia air, which smelled of home and of everything she had lost and of everything she had carried, and she had cried finally properly, with Calvin's arm around her shoulders and the Blue Ridge in the distance, and the crying had not felt like defeat. It had felt like the last of something being released. They had gone back to Nevada. They had gone home. On an evening in the fall of 1880, 7 years after Augusta had arrived in Harlan Creek with her satchel clutched to her chest, she sat on the porch of the ranch house with Calvin and watched the sun go down over the valley. Thomas, who was 5, was chasing something in the yard with the absolute conviction of purpose that 5-year-old boys bring to chasing things. Clara, too, was asleep inside, which happened occasionally, and was always treated as a gift of some magnitude. The sky was doing its thing, the rose and copper and the deep amber, the mountains turning colors that had no proper names, the first stars appearing at the edge of the darkening east. Calvin's hand was in hers. It was a thing so ordinary and so established that she barely noted it as a discrete fact anymore, the way you stop noting the weight of a coat you wear every day. She held his hand and watched the sky and listened to Thomas narrating his chase to himself in the yard, a running monologue that involved a great deal of dramatic reporting of his own progress. "He sounds like your brother," Calvin said. "Yes," she said, "he does." And it was only happiness when she said it, no shadow of sorrow, because sorrow was part of the story but was no longer the whole of it, and she had learned to let it coexist with everything else that had grown up around it. The stars came in over the ridge, the Nevada stars, enormous and indifferent and beautiful, and the valley below them settled into its evening quiet, and Harlan Creek's lights flickered in the distance, small and warm and permanent. Thomas caught whatever he had been chasing and delivered a triumphant report at full volume. Calvin called him in for supper. Augusta stood from the porch steps and went to fetch Clara, who had woken and was making her opinions known from the back room. And in the kitchen the lamp was lit, and the food was on the stove, and the window was warm with light, and she could see Calvin lifting Thomas onto the chair at the table, and she could hear Thomas telling his father about the catch in exhaustive detail. She stood in the doorway for a moment with Clara on her hip, and she felt the full weight of it, the full, improbable, hard-won, specific, irreplaceable weight of this life, this house, this man, these children, this land. She had stepped off a stage in a bruise-colored morning with nothing but a satchel and a grief she had been carrying so long she had mistaken it for her natural state. She had been so careful, so contained, so efficiently self-protective that for a long time she had believed she was fine when she was in fact simply sealed. She had been afraid of hands, of what they meant and what they required and what they could take, and she had been handed a cup of coffee on a cold ridge and taken it, and their fingers had met, and the world had not ended but had, in fact, finally, properly, begun again. Thomas was explaining the catch to his father with expansive gestures. Calvin was listening with his full attention, the way he always listened, the way he had always listened to everyone, to every small thing, to her when she had finally, haltingly learned to speak. "Augusta," Calvin called from the table, not urgently, just the natural address of a man calling to his wife in a warm kitchen. "Come sit." She went in. She sat. She put Clara down between them and poured the coffee, good coffee, because she had made certain they always had good coffee, because Thomas deserved it, and because she had decided that certain small dignities were worth insisting on, and she poured Calvin's cup and handed it to him. And their fingers met around the cup the way they always had, warm and certain, and he met her eyes over it with his steady gray-green look, and she felt it still, after all this time. The warmth traveling up her arm and into the center of her chest. It never got old. She had wondered if it would get old, and it never did. Every time he handed her something and their fingers met, or she handed something to him, there was a trace of that first enormous moment, the moment when she had put her hand in his and felt the warmth travel all the way in and had known clearly for the first time in years, that she was not merely surviving, she was living. Fully, ungrudgingly, with the whole of herself, that she had managed to reassemble the broken parts and the healed parts, and the parts that would always bear the marks of what they had been through. "Good coffee," Calvin said. "Always," she said. Thomas had moved on from the catch to a comprehensive theory about why the catch had been difficult, which required quite a lot of hand gestures. Clara was attempting to put a bread crust in her ear, which Augusta redirected with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had learned that toddlers required constant redirection, and had found this unexpectedly manageable. Calvin listened to Thomas and watched Augusta redirect Clara, and was doing the thing he always did, which was being fully present in the life in front of him without reservation or performance. The lamp burned warm. The mountain stood dark against the stars. The valley was quiet, with the particular quiet of a place that knows itself and is at peace with what it knows. Augusta held her coffee cup in both hands and looked at the people around her table and felt, in her clean and ordered heart, the long ledger of her life balancing finally, column against column, loss against love, grief against gratitude, all of it adding up to something that she could not have predicted from any single entry, but that was, in its total, exactly enough.